So are you ready? Yeah. If I start?
Yep.
Okay. Okay, I think we'll start. Can you hear me, first thing? That's good. Okay, so thank you very much for coming this evening. This is the fourth lecture in the series, and as I do every year, I want to thank my colleagues for giving me this amazing surprise birthday present 4 years ago. I don't know if they expected me still to be here 4 years down the line. But I could thank them anyway for being completely non-ageist and letting me stay on. But especially I want to thank Dave for agreeing to come and give the lecture, and I'll say more about that in a minute. But first, I thought I would just say that, I don't know if you know, but we are a very select band of people here. We are people who, I think, are not going to the Sociolinguistics Symposium in Finland, or not going tomorrow morning, I assume. Anyway, although Dave is, I believe.
Not tomorrow morning, but...
Okay, so it starts on Sunday evening. And when we planned this date, I thought sociolinguists might like to stop off in London tonight on their way to Finland for the Sociolinguistics Symposium, because that is what Dave said he was going to do, after all. But the Scandinavians have outfoxed us, and they've organised 5 or 6 different workshops in different places in Copenhagen and other places in Finland and so on, and they're all taking place today. So we are quite a small select group, as I said, but I think in many ways that's nicer, because we'll have a chance to chat properly after the lecture, and we can chat to Dave. So I think that's fine. So thanks to you for coming, and thanks to Dave for coming to give the lecture. So Dave is Professor of Modern English Linguistics at the University of Bern in Switzerland. We've known each other for a very long time. We both had the same PhD supervisor, Peter Trudgill, and we're really pleased that he's come tonight with Jean. Dave did his PhD a long time before me, obviously. But nevertheless, we had the same supervisor, and we worked together to prepare the book that was published in Peter's honour a few years ago, and that was a really good experience for me. I've never worked with such an obliging co-author. We were both completely overwhelmed with admin. I expect you know what that's like at the time, and we each took over the reins when the other couldn't cope, and somehow we just managed to get it done in time. So that was a very nice experience. So Dave's always been a very original researcher. At a time when sociolinguistics were all going off to work in cities, Dave decided he was going to work in the country, and he did his PhD on the English spoken in the Fens. He was, I think, unique in bringing together social dialectology and human geography, and he's still doing this, and he's focusing at the moment on the mobilities paradigm, and he'll tell you all about that later on, I think, if you want to ask him. He told me when I asked him earlier on. So he's got lots of publications in this field, and he's much in demand to write about it and to talk about his work and the general approach. He also works on varieties of English around the world, varieties that at the time were not very well known, like New Zealand English. He was one of the first people to work on that. He's worked on English in the Falkland Islands and in the Pacific Islands, like the one he's going to be talking about tonight. And he always takes a new angle and finds out something about language in general, not just about the variety that he's working on. So he's also done influential work in other areas on dialect contact, dialect attrition. He's edited the vast second edition of Language in the British Isles. He's on the board of English Worldwide and the Journal of Linguistic Geography, and he's associate editor of the Journal of Sociolinguistics. Now, one advantage of this for us is that Wiley Blackwell, who published the Journal of Sociolinguistics, have given us some money to sponsor the reception. So we have to thank them for that. And I also have to thank the School of Languages, Linguistics and Film for putting up the rest of the money, most of the money actually, especially as the head of school is here tonight, so I could thank you, David. Okay, and I'd also like to thank Annette and Agnieszka, who have done the organisation for this lecture. You'll have seen their amazing posters, I think, as you try to find your way to the lecture theatre, I think. So, as well as all of Dave's many accomplishments, he's really a very nice chap. So, he's been a very good friend and a very good colleague to me over the years. So, please welcome David Britton, talking to us about English in Paradise, a new variety in the Pacific.
Thank you. Thank you, Jenny, for that very nice introduction. Thank you for thinking of me for this series. I am following some very prestigious previous speakers, and I feel very honoured and humbled to be invited to come and address you all. I want to first of all say that my talk today is collaborative work with Kazuko Matsumoto from the University of Tokyo. Kazuko and I have been working on post-colonial varieties in the Pacific for 10 years now. And Kazuko's principally been working on post-colonial Japaneses in the Pacific. And it's with her that we have now begun to look at post-colonial Englishes in Micronesia. So Kazuko's role in this research is absolutely vital. Given that it's supposed to be the hottest day of the year, it seems therefore rather appropriate to travel off to Paradise to investigate varieties of English today. And so my talk is going to be looking at the sociohistorical and sociopolitical development and also linguistic development of a new variety of English in the northern Pacific. And as far as I'm aware, there has been no other linguistic descriptive studies of such varieties. Let's see if I press the right button here. Yes. So we're talking about Palau, which is in Micronesia. And so first of all, I will tell you where Palau is. And we'll have a brief colonial history of Palau. Palau has had a rather complex last century. Palau does not have English as its first language, and many of the varieties which have emerged in L2 English contexts have been examined through a model developed by Edgar Schneider called the dynamic model, which looks at the development of post-colonial Englishes. Schneider's model attempts to account for the development of all post-colonial Englishes. And what I want to try and argue is that the Palauan case is an interesting one to examine through his model because it stretches it somewhat by looking at a case rather different from many of the cases that he applies to the model in his book. We will then look at the situation of the English language in Palau since 1945, look at some linguistic characteristics, before briefly looking at some issues that we are now beginning to think about, having done a first wave of research on Palauan English. You should all have a handout. They're scattered up there. You'll need the handout partly because I have put a lot of the linguistic detail on the handout, but partly because later on I will play an extract from one of our more basilectal speakers of Palauan English, and you will need the handout to follow the snippet of talk from one of our Palauan informants. Okay, so where is Palau? Here is the Pacific Ocean, and Palau is here. It is in Micronesia, and one of a number of independent republics that have emerged in the last 20 years in the area, in the northern Pacific area, among a number of other countries that have emerged from those islands. We'll talk about the colonial history a bit later on. Palau has been independent, and I've put independent in inverted commas, since 1994. It has a population of only 20,000, and a number of languages are spoken on the islands. There is Palauan, which is Austronesian, but there are a number of disputes about what sort of Austronesian variety it is. There are two Micronesian languages, Sonstrolese and Tobian, spoken in southern islands of the Palauan group. And then there are a number of colonial immigrant languages, English, Japanese, various languages of the Philippines, other Micronesian languages, and also Chinese and Sylheti, and a number of other languages from the Indian subcontinent, and Korean as well. The first formal colonial power was Spain, who ruled the Palauan Islands from 1885 to 1899, and then they sold them to Germany, who controlled them until 1914, and then Japan took over in 1914 until the end of the Pacific War. The Spanish and German rule was principally the Spanish and Germans in Palau largely had a missionary role. The Germans were interested in the phosphate reserves that were found in Palau, but the Japanese were the first and only colonial power who saw Palau as a potential settlement colony. Particularly from the late 1920s onwards, lots of Japanese workers moved to Palau to settle, working as fishermen and working in the fields, and lived alongside Palauans, and the Palauans who were living with them acquired a very high level of Japanese, to the extent that Japanese people think that they speak some dialect of the Japanese mainland. Really a very it was a bilingual community by the 1930s. Koror, what was until very recently the capital of Palau, was variously described from the 1930s as a little Tokyo, a suburb of Yokohama, and it is generally recognised that the Japanese period in Palau was the one that saw both the greatest integration of the colonial power and the indigenous population, and also the greatest degree of social and educational development. The Japanese established a systematic education and training system, and as I say, a large bilingual population emerged. Everything changed in 1945 at the end of the Pacific War. The United States controlled the islands for a few months, and then they were given control of them by the United Nations in a trust territory ship called the Trust Territory of the Pacific Islands, along with other islands in Micronesia, not all of the Micronesian islands, but many of them, including what is now the Federated States of Micronesia to the north east of Palau, and also the Marshall Islands and the Northern Mariana Islands. Now, the goal of the trust territory ships generally around the world after the Second World War were that the trustee was to prepare those societies for self-determination. So they were not considered to be colonial powers in the same way that we might consider other colonial contexts. And then in 1994, Palau finally became independent, but independent within a compact of free association with the United States. And it was the final trust territory in the world to gain independence. Whenever you see the word free in titles like this, it always reminds me of countries that need to use the word democratic in their title. Yeah, they rarely are, right? So they use the word in the title of the country. And free is kind of an interesting concept in the when we're talking about the relationship between Palau and the United States. Palau, recognised as a member of the UN, almost always votes the same way as the US in the UN, especially on issues relating to Israel and Cuba, for example. One of their ministers, Sandra Pierantozzi, in 2009 said, "We don't want to jeopardise that relationship with the US because it would affect Palau's economic welfare." So they knew which way their bread was buttered. Presidential elections always take place on the same day as the US. Palau has taken prisoners from Guantanamo Bay, and in exchange for a large amount of money, the US reserves the right to use Palau for military purposes if necessary, and to prevent other countries from using Palau for such purposes. Even this is the palace of the president of Palau. Does it remind you of anything? amazing for a country of 20,000 people, right? But you can see, therefore, that the model is American, and that Palau has to handle those relationships with the US very carefully in case the money gets cut off. Okay, so we'll briefly have a little excursion into Schneider's dynamic model before returning to Palau to see how Palau fits that model. Now, Schneider, who developed this dynamic model in his 2007 book, said that the motivation for trying to develop a model was that much research on World Englishes had been carried out without any attempt to try and generalise across many varieties. There were lots of studies of individual varieties and very little attempt to see what they had in common or how they differed. So he said that the predominant tendency has been to regard these varieties as individual linguistic entities, independent of each other, and products of unique circumstances determined by geography and history. And what he wanted to do was suggest that there was some underlying process that drives the formation of post-colonial Englishes and accounts for the similarities between them. So he said that the evolution of post-colonial Englishes is understood as a sequence of characteristic stages of identity rewritings and associated linguistic changes affecting the parties involved in a colonial contact setting. He says that there are 5 such stages, and that different groups in the post-colonial society experience those stages in different ways. So he talks about a coloniser, a settler strand, a colonised, an IDG, indigenous strand, and sometimes an ADS strand, an ad straight strand, where another group has joined the community that is neither the coloniser nor the colonised. And one of the examples that he uses in his book is the example of Greeks and Italians in Australia. And within each stage there are 4 parameters that he looks at: the socio-political background, so how did it come to be that way, this thing he calls identity constructions, which basically means how well did the different groups get on with each other, the sociolinguistic conditions, so language use, types of contact and so on in the community, as well as the, for linguists, most important bits, which are the linguistic consequences of those developments. These are the 5 stages. The foundation stage, when the colony is first developed. We have exonormative stabilisation, where a colonised power develops a relatively stable linguistic situation where the language norms of an outside community are the ones which are held up as the standard. We then have the process of nativisation, where local forms develop that are distinctive from forms that occur elsewhere. Endonormative stabilisation, where the local norm becomes the local standard. And finally, differentiation, where regional and social varieties that hadn't previously existed begin to emerge within the context of the endonormatively determined speech community. Now, looking at Palauan English in this model is kind of interesting because it's unlike many of the others presented in Schneider's book. It's based on US colonialism of some kind and not British. Whereas in Schneider's book, all of the cases he examined, bar 1, are cases of British colonial rule. The exception is the Philippines, where Schneider says that American intervention at the end of the 19th century and beginning of the 20th century was particularly intensive. And that's not what happened in Palau. And also, the development of English in Palau is very recent. Although there were English-based pidgins and creoles floating around the Pacific in the 18th and 19th centuries, it is pretty clear that those had died out at the latest by the end of the German period. And so English really has only been a community language in Palau since 1945. And most of Schneider's examples relate to earlier examples of colonialism, where English has had longer to take hold. So, back to Palau. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the US role was not as a colonial power, but as a trustee. And their task, according to the United Nations, was to supervise the administration of the trust territories and to ensure that governments responsible for their administration take adequate steps to prepare them for the achievement of the Charter goals, and this was political, economic and social advancement, self-government, self-determination, human rights, and so on. The Americans refused to accept the trust territory of the Pacific Islands under the same regulations as everybody else had to, and basically gave themselves more powers than the other trust territories had given. So basically they had these rules, but sort of gave themselves the power to ignore them when they needed to. They weren't overtly recognising, but secret documents which became released in the 1960s showed that the Americans recognised they had a bit of a dilemma in what to do with Micronesia. On the one hand, they had these nice United Nations requirements to prepare these islands for self-determination. On the other hand, they recognised that self-determination was perhaps not a very good thing for United States geopolitical desires. So what they did was to do nothing. And basically they decided that no plan at all was probably the best plan. So to not really encourage the Palauans to develop a local economy, to develop some self-sustaining method of running the country, to not really try and educate the population, but doing nothing would be the most peaceful way of maintaining the status quo. So for at least 17 years, they did nothing. And this led to a creation of dependence, because they threw a certain amount of money at some of the tribal chiefs and developed a small local elite who would run the country and behave themselves. That local elite was educated in the US, given lots of favours, treated very nicely, and the rest of the population basically was left to survive with virtually no developed education system, a very basic education system, much poorer than the system that the Japanese had put in place before the war. And as Schuster says, educational issues were to a great extent forgotten by the American government. Another factor immediately after the war was that the Japanese in Palau were returned to Japan. So consequently the population dropped from about 40,000 just before the war to about 6,000 in 1945. And consequently they lost the whole administrative sector of the population, a lot of the managerial sector, a lot of the skill base was evicted. And so the Palauans had to go back to fishing and cultivating taro. Then, in the 1960s, following the Bay of Pigs, and there was an increasing recognition that these Micronesian islands were particularly crucial and valuable, with the Cold War beginning to escalate. So Kennedy decided to actually then pump lots and lots and lots of aid, of educational programs into Micronesia. Lots of temporary volunteer Peace Corps workers were sent to Palau. At one point there was one worker for every 100 Palauans. So suddenly all these temporary Americans arrived to improve the education system. Certain elite Palauans were still farmed back off to the US to gain a higher education, and essentially just lots of money was thrown at Palau to keep them sweet, and to ensure the continued collaboration of Palau with American rule. So this idea of compact money emerged, where each Palauan family got given a healthy dose of money, and so they often used it to buy in Philippine domestic workers to look after the kids, to cook and clean, but also as doctors and teachers eventually as well. And so as a result of this, Palau became much more clearly diglossic, with English as the H variety, and Palauan healthily, and still healthily, as the L variety. Independence has changed very little, because it's not real independence in the sense that it's not economic independence. They're still reliant totally, or almost totally, on the American aid. There is still a large influx of Philippine workers to work in Palauan families. Still, elite Palauans are taken off to the US for further education, and so on. So if we begin to try and place this situation within Schneider's model, we can see that Palauan English has passed what Schneider calls the foundation stage, the socio-political background of which is essentially English arriving in a new territory, and that has English has arrived in the sense that English became the official language of Palau in 1945, but English speakers didn't really arrive. There were a few navy folk there for a few years after the war, and a few administrators, but never any significant settlement from the US at all. So in this sense, Palau is rather unlike, or doesn't really neatly fit into Schneider's expectation that there will be some initial influx of a set of migrants to run the colony. In terms of identity construction, Schneider expects that the settlers always assume that they're going to go home. And that's clear that the settlers who went to Palau in the immediate years after the war felt that way. They were explicitly there on temporary contracts. Few were there for more than a couple of years. And this is true right through to the present day. None of the American workers who go to Palau were there were expected to be there for very long periods of time, and they weren't. One thing that Schneider often points to is what he calls a planned establishment of a local elite, and he says that in many cases of post-colonial Englishes, you get the colonial power privileging members of a local elite to run the country in their name. The linguistic consequences of the foundation stage are essentially toponymic borrowings, and that certainly took place. There are very, very few English place names in Palau, and those that there are only emerged much later on when Palau developed a tourist industry interestingly, for essentially Japanese tourists. Oops. The second stage, the exonormative stabilisation stage, I guess we can really point to the post-1962 period is when that began to develop in Palau. There was a massive increase in educational resources. The Americans set up the Congress of Micronesia to begin to consider self-determination, but that didn't go as smoothly as they liked. They had wanted there to be a very smooth transition from trusteeship into the Compact of Free Association, and consequently very, very little change in the relationship between the US and these islands. But Palau particularly didn't really care very much for the American idea of a compact of free association. In the build-up to Palauan independence, Palau decided to be nuclear free. And that didn't go down very well with the US. And consequently, Palauans were asked in a number of referenda to vote for the compact, and the constitution said that they had to get a 2/3 majority. And the Americans could never get a 2/3 majority in favour of the compact. During this period, 2 presidents died in rather suspicious circumstances. And there was a lot of lawlessness of various kinds, shootings, boats being sunk, attacks on people's houses. It was really quite nasty and quite heated. Various politicians against the compact disappeared, and in the end, they had to change the constitution to reduce the necessity of a 2/3 majority down to a 50% majority, and in the end they managed to get the compact agreed by the Palauans by a small majority to enable the compact to come into place and Palau to become independent in 1994. The other Micronesian islands went a bit more quietly. The Northern Mariana Islands, indeed, decided to become a Commonwealth of the US. So they're now in a situation very much like Puerto Rico. And the other Micronesian islands, so the Federated States of Micronesia and the Marshall Islands, entered the compact with much less fuss than took place in Palau. In terms of identity construction, the 1960 period saw an influx of US workers, particularly Peace Corps, who were very sympathetic to the Palauan cause. And they were quite active in reporting back to the US some of the terrible things that the US were doing at that time. One nice example from a Peace Corps person I met recently said that the Palauans were encouraged not to grow local fruit because they could import it very nicely in cans from the US. And this kind of nonsense was reported back by the Peace Corps folk who clearly regarded this as utterly ridiculous. But you can see how this dependence on American importation and so on was still going on until very, very recently. Still is going on until very, very recently. The US funds at this period were still promoting a small local elite, which, and this is partly because knowledge of English, Schneider says, gives them an extra edge of experience and competitiveness within their own group. Interestingly, the elite in Palau have very strongly been promoting Palauan as a national language. So Palauan is now a national language along with English, and they're encouraging the teaching of Palauan in schools. And meanwhile, they send their kids off for an education in English in America. So the very folk who are telling the Palauans that they should be speaking Palauan actually are not getting their kids to speak Palauan. Their kids are going off to California or to Hawaii for higher education. So a very interesting ideological characteristic. And then you have a rather important ad-straight strand, the Philippine migrant workers who started to arrive in the 1960s. A quarter of the population of Palau is from the Philippines. And because their Philippine languages are not mutually intelligible with Palauan, although some of them are loosely related, they speak English. So much more important in terms of the community development of English in Palau has probably been Philippine English rather than American English. A lot of the teachers are from the Philippines. And so consequently, this is a case where the ad-straight language, or the ad-straight variety, is especially important, I think, in the development of the local variety. Unlike, possibly, in many of the other cases that Schneider points to with adstract situations. So when we begin to look at the linguistic characteristics and origins of Palauan English, I think Philippine English is going to be particularly relevant in understanding where Palauan English comes from, given that many of these Philippine workers are child carers and are speaking to the kids in English because those Philippines don't speak Palauan. So Palauan English bilingualism has replaced Palauan Japanese bilingualism. The Japanese speakers in the community are now incredibly elderly. So Kazuko has has been working now for 15 years looking at obsolescent Palauan Japanese. But as the community who speak Japanese there is dying out, that's been replaced with Palauan English bilingualism. As I said, more English input comes from migrant workers than from the colonizer. And interestingly, local ideologies are such that the migrant workers, the Philippines, are seen as a bad influence on the transmission of Palauan because they're not assisting the transmission of Palauan because they don't speak it with the kids. But we have found no negative comments about the Philippine English that is being used in the community. The end of stage 2 is where it begins to get more interesting for the linguist, because it is the, Schneider says, the kick-off phase for the process of structural nativization, the emergence of structures which are distinctive to the newly evolving variety. And we will see some examples of that now. We have a corpus of Palauan English, which at the moment stands at 20, 12 of which were collected in 2000, and a new corpus is being collected now. So we have 8 speakers from a relatively recently collected corpus, which is going to be completed later this year, to enable us to look at the sort of real-time diachronic development of Palauan English, and to see whether, with that sort of 14-15 year gap, there have been linguistic developments in the emergence of Palauan English. So we will now look briefly at the phonology, grammar and lexis of Palauan English, and then we'll listen to a clip. The analysis is qualitative at this stage, and is enabling us to locate particular features that we would want to consider in more detail. But one of the things that we have noticed, and you'll see this when we get to the clip, one of the developments which suggests potentially that nativization is going on is a very heavy use in our 2013-14 data of Palauan discourse markers in the English. So from our 8 speakers, we have about 560 examples of these Palauan discourse markers. In the 2000 data, there were none. Not one example of these discourse markers. So something's going on whereby these discourse marker forms are suddenly becoming very important in the use of English. But we obviously need to do a more systematic comparison of the 2 sets of data to look at other factors. Okay, so on your handout, you will see some transcriptions of the vowel system. I'm not going to go through all this, but just point to a few things. You could point to the fact that the kit and dress vowels are rather close. The distinction, as one might expect for World Englishes, between kit and fleece is rather small. Strut and lot overlap. That's not surprising for World Englishes either. Fleece and goose are close and short and show no diphthongization, and goose is not fronting. Face and goat have got mid-close nuclei with a little bit of glide reduction. Goat is not fronting. Unstressed syllables are often realised not with schwa but with a front vowel, so you get things like horses for horses, and the schwa of comma usually ends up as a, so comma. I think the consonants are a bit more interesting. T can be realised as a glottal stop as well as a flap intervocalically. The velars are often uvular, and you'll hear some of this later on. Voice stops are often devoiced, so dicking for digging. Word final d is often the or th. Z is almost always s. And the affricates are usually, well, ch is usually ts, so we get things like taropats for taro patch. And it is semi-rhotic, H retaining, L is relatively clear, and there is yod dropping after coronals and after M, so we get music instead of music. There is a minor tendency to avoid consonant clusters. Glottal stop is often used as a hiatus breaker. Heavily reduced syllables are rare, and so small function words are often reduced, as they are in many other outer circle world Englishes. So to is almost always to and not t, and so on. And there are some interesting different stress assignments. So complicated and open, elementary for elementary. We'll see elementary later. The grammar, has to be said, is not very exciting. There are lots of examples on your handout, and I will skip through a few of them, mention them briefly as we go. I can't not mention third person present tense zero with Peter Trudgill in the room. That's very common. If there is a temporal adverb denoting past tense time, past time, or a clause in the past, subsequent linked clauses use the present tense. Yeah. Plural marking, 15 more minute. Very common in world Englishes. Too hot tea. Occasional pro-drop. Syntacticians get very excited about Palauan pro-drop. And there is more pro-drop than one might expect, I think, in Palauan English, so that might be something that we should look at in more detail. Non-standard article use, no article allomorphy, so there's a old age centre, he's a old man, a importer, and then lexis. As you might expect, there are words borrowed from Palauan. So words like abai, which is a local meeting house. Ngasek is a ceremony that takes place when a married woman has had her first baby. And tolu is a bowl that is used for ceremonial exchanges of money. Matai comes from Philippine languages, so Tagalog means to die. There's this term custom, which apparently is used quite widely across the Pacific. In Palau, custom takes place when somebody needs to spend a lot of money on something, a roof or a wedding or a big journey, and so basically people go to their relatives and their friends and they ask for custom, and people give them lots of money, and then those people who have given lots of money can then 6 months later, if they need to build a new roof, go to their friends and say, I need custom, and so they get given lots of money back. So this is custom, and apparently it's a concept which is also used in Melanesia. I've certainly had reports of it in Melanesia as well. And finally, we can point to the fact that Palauan English demonstrates more American-oriented than British-oriented lexis in some cases. So the use of tourney, which I don't think British people ever use that word, do they? For tournament? No. Baby shower, well, yeah. And to slate an event. For me, to slate is to criticise. But in American English, it's to schedule. So lots of events are slated in Palau, and that was a bit confusing for me at first. Anyway, so this is some of the flavour of the lexis that we're finding in our data. Okay, let's have a listen then to our speaker. Just find this here. You need your transcript for this. We have 2 Palauan teenage men chatting about the fact that one of them has had for throughout his childhood to tuck his trousers into his socks. Okay, so that's the context of the story. Perhaps I can grab a handout so I can follow it as well. Okay, let's hope the sound comes up okay.
When I was young, I never used to tell my new friends or when I was young. In elementary, first grade, I started talking. The red and the white t-shirt started talking, and I didn't notice that it was. But I was used to it, and I became like 8th grade and still tucked in. This one father, I tell you my pants, I tucked in, and the material we buy from Surang, we work from Surang, and then we go to my pants. But when we wash, it shrinks, and then it shrinks. It never, not like this is like slacks. But material is. And then my mom wasn't right when it dries. It shrinks, and then I tell my dad to buy my new pair of pants of uniform. He forced me that it's really good. It's I was 7th grade. I almost cried. I want my new clothes. I don't want to go to school. And he insisted on me to go to school there. So I forgot that it was short. It was really short there, so I used to get long socks. I wear shoes doing the long socks there. My friends Kwan and Ivan and the ladies. Our classmates Tanya. No, at first they didn't tease me. And they and they saw it. They started teasing me, so I went to my house. Even my mom said it's short. My dad insisted me, and it looks good, look handsome. But I was young, so I didn't know style, so I just so I forced myself to wear that kind of pants until 8th grade. And then still tucked in there. So when I promoted from elementary, they make a new rules for the school based on me. Only me from elementary until 8th grade. Tucked in there. I wasn't sure because I got used to it. But when my friends went to play basket at the court, usually, so I only take out my tuck in and tuck out, so I play basket. They basket with tenants and they tuck in, always tease me. So I only stood by and tuck in my t-shirt there. Then when I came to Palau High School, the first thing that my parents did said, hey, you wanna tuck in when you go Palau? Ole! I want to melt oil, tuck in Palau High School. Oh, that's big high school there, and they wanted Yeah.
People from different
If you
schools.
don't want me as your job, I'll just kill you. I don't want to embarrass me in front of a lot of students. Yeah. And so I forced myself not to kill you. The first day of Palau High School.
Oh.
Maybe we used to big crowds already willing to hear this.
And you'll have noticed throughout that extract the use of the words ara and era and ole, and these are the discourse markers that I was telling you about. These are words which are terms of address. Ole is a term of address to well, when you look in the dictionary, you'll see that ole is a term of address to a younger male, and the ara is a term of address between males of either equal or lower status. We have females doing these things, so they've clearly they're not restrained by those prescriptions. And as I said, in the data from 2000, we have no examples of this. So the data show that these forms are being liberally used now in the English, and they look like a fruitful thing to investigate further to see how they're functioning, and the extent to which they have different functions from each other in the Palauan data. Okay then, so a discussion of the linguistic data, I think, shows us that Palauan English is more distinctive phonologically than grammatically. It shares many features with Philippine Englishes, perhaps not surprisingly. And so one of our questions is Palauan English the way it is because of influence of Philippine English, or are they simply shared substrate effects, given the fact that the languages of the Philippines are relatively structurally similar to Palauan? But also these features are many of these features are common to World Englishes generally. So perhaps we will be going down the wrong avenue to solely focus on the Philippine-ness of some of these forms. Obviously we have to take into consideration Palauan, particularly given the fact that the settler numbers were very low for the first 20 odd years. One might expect, given that English was still the official language in schools during that period when there were very few settlers there, one might expect that Palauan might be particularly influential, and we can see some potential points where Palauan and Palauan English seem to coincide. So Palauan has no z, and neither does Palauan English from our data. Palauan d has got incidental allophones, and it does too in Palauan English. Palauan has 6 vowels, and when one looks at the Palauan English short vowel system, it seems to be doing its best to force itself into a 6 vowel system to a certain extent. So there are bits of evidence which suggest that the Palauan substrate is actually very important in the structure of Palauan English. In the future, we obviously need to look more closely at the influence of Palauan and try to distinguish between the influence of Palauan. Some have suggested, probably right, that we need to look also at the potential influence of Japanese, because many of the speakers in the early Palauan English speech community were fluent speakers of Japanese, were bilingual in Palauan and Japanese. The influence of languages of the Philippines as well may well be important. We're also interested in the sociolinguistic complexity of the community. Obviously, there will be sociolinguistic patterning of the variation we're finding, and one of the things that seems to be relevant is, as others have found, people like Jenny Cheshire looking at Tristan da Cunha have found that time spent off the island is particularly relevant in shaping language variation. And that seems to be, in a very qualitative way, what seems to be going on in Palau as well, that those folk who have not spent time off Palau seem to have a much more basilectal variety of Palauan English, whereas those who have spent time in the US, in Hawaii or in Guam or in the mainland, have fewer of these features that I've described here, and more convergence towards a more American sounding variety, among some of the speakers who spent quite a lot of time in the US. The other Micronesian Englishes, I think, also lend themselves to investigation. Guam has been American since the late 19th century, so has had a much more intensive American contact and a much more intensive use of English in the community. The Northern Mariana Islands now are a Commonwealth of the US, but became so much more recently. The Federated States and the Marshalls had much less influence from Japanese. And Kiribati is Micronesian, but had a British and Australian colonial past. And so it would be interesting also to see whether that difference has affected the Englishes that develop in Micronesia. And all of these varieties, as far as I'm aware, are completely unresearched from the point of view of world Englishes. And then we need to look more closely at the potential for nativization. And I think the discourse markers that I mentioned earlier are one place to begin to see how these Palauan forms are embedding themselves in the local English. And this is clearly one absolutely characteristic version of Palauan English that no other world English has got, because these forms are not found, as far as we can tell, in other Micronesian or other languages in Micronesia. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you. Of course.
Okay, so we have time for a few questions or comments. David.
I'm just wondering about the very strong uvularization of all these velars. So Palauan, it doesn't have a uvular series as far as I know. In fact, you don't find uvular series in that part of the world at all.
No.
Neither does Japanese.
No.
What?
It's not.
It's also broadly typologically unmarked to not have a velar, to have a uvular kind of like set of. That's far more unmarked. That's far more marked than velar.
Yeah, I mean they're not so unusual in World Englishes though. So Multicultural London English has them, and Peter was talking about St Helena. Was it? Yeah. Having them? We've come across a couple of other varieties that from Africa that are reported to have uvular forms for those as well, but they're not in Palauan, and yeah, that's kind of unusual. And we don't find them so much amongst those speakers who've been outside the community very much. So I think this is going to be one of the features which will distinguish the travelled and the non-travelled. Those who've had contact with Englishes outside Palau and those who haven't.
Can I just add a word of caution there? Thank you, Jenny. Have we heard Palauan? I mean, do we know for a fact with our own ears that they don't have uvulars?
That's true.
Yeah.
Sorry?
That's true.
That's true.
Because there are many of these Pacific Ocean languages which are said to have a velar series, but actually when you New Zealand Maori, for example, they actually sound they're very bad velar. I mean,
Right,
it may just
okay.
be a straight transfer.
Yeah.
And the phonological descriptions are rather phonological rather than phonetic. It's a possibility.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, and Palauan doesn't have a n either, which is rather unusual for languages in that area, of languages generally. But they seem to have no issue with doing n's in Palauan English. Interestingly, so when we discovered that they have no n, I thought, oh, that might be interesting, but no.
I was wondering about prosodic features after having listened to the extract, and I'm wondering if that's a way that you might be able to tease apart to the different influences from Japanese or American English or Palauan itself, because at least to me, the most salient thing that I was hearing was even the placement of the pitch accents seemed very, very odd in English, at least. So I'm wondering if that's how it is in Palauan, or if that's how it is in, say, one of the Filipino Englishes or Philippine languages. And that might be a way to try and tease apart where these different things are coming from.
Yeah, that's something we'll have to do. I mean, the sort of grammars we have of Palauan are fairly old, but yeah, I think that's something that we can hunt around in to see whether they shed any light on that, and then to try and find some Palauans and see what they do. Yeah.
I was just wondering, for example, the boys who were speaking in the extract, were they considered native speakers of Palauan English? Did they learn it as a child? Did they learn English as children, or would they have acquired it later on in life?
Their schooling was in English, so. I mean, obviously, the native speaker issue is kind of an interesting one for all of these world Englishes, really, and to what extent are they? I mean, English is not these chaps' first language, but it's been a language that's been with them from the age of 5 or 6. So, yeah, I mean, it's in this kind of liminal space between nativeness and non-nativeness that where all the exciting things with world Englishes kind of are generated, I guess. And so we're trying not to get too bogged down in that issue, because the very messiness of it is what is generating world Englishes anyway, I guess. But yeah, it's an important issue to bear in mind, I think.
I'm wondering what societal pressure there is to maintain a Palauan identity, because it sounds like those who've gone abroad and come back with a new accent, just having lived in India for a while, you see this difference. Like, there's some communities that are like, yay, you have an American accent now, that's really awesome, but then there's other communities that really will mock it out of you. So people will actually switch between their, even in English, having a very local accent when they're speaking to their friends, and only using the American accent with outsiders. So I'm just curious, because it sounds like, is it more prestigious to have an American accent, or is there more pressure now that they're pushing Palauan to have that identity?
All of our recordings were of Palauans speaking to friends of theirs. So they're pairs of teenage lads, teenage women, older women, speaking in pairs with Kazalkor who sort of collected the data not there. And whilst the elite Palauans are more likely to have American experience and to have been off the island, we have no evidence in the data that there are strong positive or negative attitudes associated with one or the other way of speaking English. There may well be, but not in the data that we've got. There seems to be a concern, as I mentioned earlier, about the negative impact of the Philippine migrant workers on the Palauan, and our sense is that ideological questions about the status of Palauan are more salient than about varieties of English. Palauan is healthy, and the population speaks Palauan, apart from some very, very elite youngsters who were farmed off to America very, very young. So it seems that is where those ideological concerns are aired, rather than about the Englishes in our evidence. So I don't have negative evidence to be able to say that one is valued higher more than the other.
Just a data question: what's the status of the Philippine workers in Palau? Are they there as guest workers and short-term visas, and they go home, or so there are no kids being raised as Filipino kids growing up in Palau?
I think there are, but they're not on long-term contracts. or at least certainly the domestic workers aren't. They're treated pretty appallingly, with the exception of those who are teachers and doctors, for example.
They're longer term?
Doctors
are still on short term?
No, they're still relatively short-term contracts. Yeah. Yeah.
Sorry, I just saw some of the discourse markers are from Palauan, so I was wondering if there's evidence of code switching and how prepared they are to code switch, and perhaps if there were, you might not know the answer because we were just discussing attitudes, but what attitudes they have towards code switching. Should they be keeping the languages separate, or are they quite mixed up? Sorry, it's a long question.
Yeah, no. The older speakers in Kazakho's data certainly code switched very freely between Palauan and Japanese. We have some speakers who code switched between Japanese and English. Some of the older speakers who had Japanese and English were much more comfortable in Japanese than in English. So in trying to get them to speak English, they would often switch into Japanese very often. But there is not much evidence in our data of them switching to Palauan. But that could be because they were instructed to talk English. So it could be just a factor of the data collection exercise rather than what actually happens. The country's diglossic, so it wouldn't surprise me if there was not very much code switching actually. But I don't know. I'm happy to say that.
Shall we let Dave have a drink now? Yes. Okay, do join us outside for a drink and snacks. Thanks very much, Dave.
Thank you.